For this part of the research interview series, we are going to be talking to Dr. Patricia Kieran. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Mairead.
Firstly, could I ask you to tell us a bit about the research that you're involved in?
Well, I'm involved in the area of research in religious education, which is all about educating people about religious beliefs and, of course, non-religious beliefs as well. And I suppose I became interested in this when, as a student, I decided I'd like to do a master's degree on atheism. And I did that in the University of London, and I began to look at the reason why people don't believe in God and at the philosophical basis for that. And that was fascinating. And it was really, really important to take atheism and agnosticism and secularism seriously. So I did that in the late 80s. And then afterwards, I decided I'd like to do my doctorate on a French theologian who isn't particularly well known, a man called Alfred Loisy. And I went to Paris and I studied his unedited papers and manuscript there. And Loisy was a liberal thinker, and I suppose he was marginalised within the Catholic Church because he was identified as somebody who was not orthodox, and indeed he was excommunicated in 1908. But he had some wonderful ideas, and I was really interested in his theology, which has been taken up again by Vatican II, but at the time it wasn't appreciated within the Catholic Church. And I suppose from there on, I became interested in the whole idea of education and thinking critically and intelligently and passionately about issues of belief and unbelief. And of course, my background is in Catholic theology, even though I was studying atheism, agnosticism, and somebody who had been excommunicated from the Catholic Church. My whole background is in Catholic theology. So I'm interested in what is specific, what is unique to Catholics, what identity markers there are, and what makes for good Catholic education, which is inclusive, welcoming, has integrity academically and educationally. And I suppose that is the main area of my research. All of the things that I have done in the last 20 years as a researcher have been focused around key themes on education and Catholic belief and unbelief.
So how did you become involved in the research?
I suppose I became involved in research organically. It developed as a consequence of my interests originally, just myself as a researcher, what I wanted to do as a postgraduate student. And then I started to work as a lecturer. I lectured in theology in Birmingham, in Newman College, which was in the University of Birmingham. And I lectured in religious education there. So key themes and topics that I was dealing with in the classroom in my interactions with students, they began to focus my attention. And in 1998, I came back to Ireland and I came to Limerick, to Mary Immaculate College. And I was at the chalk face teaching pre-service teachers, and so I became absorbed and fascinated by areas of interest to them and of direct concern for them. So the whole politics of schooling in Ireland, the relationship between religion and education in Ireland, what's taught in primary schools, in the primary school curriculum, in Catholic schools, in a whole variety of schools, Educate Together schools, Church of Ireland schools, that became a deep area of focus and interest for me. So I came into contact with a whole variety of people who had academic interests, and I began to work collaboratively with them. So most of the articles I've written or books I've written or many of the conference presentations have been done in collaboration. One of the key themes is the rights and the experience of minority groups in education in Ireland. Minority groups, say faith groups, or also non-religious groups. So I have just been involved actually in co-editing with a man called Gareth Byrne, a book about diverse approaches to religion and education and belief in Ireland, and it's called Toward Mutual Ground. My interest in the rights of minority groups, and in particular people who traditionally might have been invisible in schools, for instance children who are coming from secular, humanist, atheist, agnostic backgrounds, is really ignited by coming into contact with people. In 2007 I got an opportunity to go on fieldwork to India, and so I visited places of worship for Baha'i, Buddhist, Sikh, Muslim, Christian and of course Hindu communities in India. And I spent a week in a Christian ashram in Shantivanam in the south of India, and I also spent a week in a Hindu ashram. So my interest in religion and researching religion and beliefs isn't only abstract or theoretical, and it certainly doesn't just come from books. It comes from contact with members of faith communities and hearing about their passions and their interest. And a key theme of my research has been exploring the multi-sensory, all-encompassing nature of belief. So for instance, here in Mary Immaculate College, I have been involved with the library in ensuring that our pre-service teachers, when they go out to teach religion in schools, that they go out with artifacts from various faith traditions, and that they are able to teach religion in a manner that appreciates that religion is fundamentally experienced. So they are equipped to teach it in a multi-sensory manner. I've also written on the fact that RE teachers in primary schools have to be creative, and that they have to explore religious traditions in terms of how they are expressed and experienced in local communities. So I would not simply be interested in Hinduism or Judaism or Catholicism as an abstract category or term. I'm interested in researching how it manifests itself in local communities. So for instance, in 2013, one of the research projects I was very fortunate to be involved in was a collaborative project spearheaded by the Anna Lindh Foundation, and the project leader was Jenny Sung from the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, and here in Mary Immaculate College the team leader on the conference that was organised was Tony Langlois, and I helped in the organisation of a conference on understanding Islam in Irish education, where we had members of Islamic faith communities and academics who are expert in Arabic studies come to Mary I and disseminate the fruits of their experience and research to our students and to the wider academic community.
What are the main themes within your research?
One of the main themes in my research is the theme of Catholic education and what is distinctive about Catholic education, and in terms of the Irish context, trying to document the history of Catholic religious education in Ireland. I suppose relatively little has been written about the history of religious education in Ireland. So one of the things that I did when I started to begin to research religious education in the Irish context was to try and document what was happening in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and the changes that came about post-Vatican II from 1962 to 1965, and then to look at new approaches that came in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. So that was an area that was fascinating, and I began to research the history of the catechism in Ireland. Many people would be familiar with the catechism method of really rote learning Catholic doctrine that was prevalent in schools right up until the 1960s. And I looked at the types of approaches, more experiential, what's called anthropological approaches that have come in since the 1970s, and child-centred approaches in the 1990s. So I suppose Catholic education would be a key theme. The question of Catholic identity and ethos and the rights of majority and minority faiths in Catholic schools is another issue. I'm interested in the changes that are emerging in Catholic schools, and I suppose in 2012 and 2013, the whole area of religious education became contested in the curriculum of schools in Ireland, and I'm looking at the academic rationale, the rationale behind including religion in the school curriculum. Now, the vast majority of my research is involved in suggesting that religious literacy, developing citizens in a country who are familiar with and sensitive to the complexity of religion, who know something about the main religious traditions in a country, as well, of course, as those of no religion, that is of huge benefit interculturally in terms of encouraging acceptance in fighting all kinds of stereotyping, religiously based stereotyping, or xenophobia or fundamentalism. So that would be a fundamental tenet of my research, the benefits of educating people about religion and about a diversity of religion for society.
Could you tell me a bit about the books that you've co-written or edited?
I co-wrote a book in 2005 with Anne Hession, who is teaching in St. Pat's in Drumcondra. And the title of the book was Children, Catholicism and Religious Education, and it was reprinted in 2009. And that book really set out to explore what religious education was all about in Irish schools, and in particular in Catholic schools. And I was interested in the area of gender, so I wrote a chapter on gender and RE. I wrote a chapter on what was distinctive about Catholic education in Ireland, and I also wrote chapters on the history of education and religious education in Ireland, as well as inclusivity and religious diversity in schools in Ireland. Again, in 2007, I worked with Anne Hession and I co-edited a book called Exploring Theology, Making Sense of the Catholic Tradition. And in that book, we invited a whole variety of experts in the principal areas of Catholic theology to break open Catholic theology and to make it accessible to a wider public. In 2009, we, Anne Hession and myself, co-edited another book, and it was called Exploring Religious Education. And one of the key themes of our research has been trying to learn from what's happening in the rest of Europe. So we asked people like Peter Schreiner and Bert Rubens and other academics to write in that book about developments on mainland Europe. We were also looking at what was happening in Scotland, in the UK, and of course what's happening in Ireland. In 2012, I had the good fortune to be involved in a collaborative research project with members of my department, the Department of Learning, Society and Religious Education at Mary Immaculate College. And in that book, 15 members of our department got together, and Peter Lang published the proceedings of our reflections and deliberations on research as a department. And I co-edited the book with Tom Grenham, who was also working in Mary Immaculate College. And in that book, various members of our department wrote about areas of research they were engaged in, and I wrote about the experience of minority faith, minority belief children in schools in Ireland.
Patricia, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.